Somewhere in the outer spiral of the Andromeda sector, where civilized space meets the wild unknown, stands the Apex Predator Academy on Velthara Prime. The institution's marketing brochures, printed on genuine prey-head parchment naturally, proudly proclaimed it as the galaxy's premier finishing school for nature's most efficient killers, because apparently even apex predators needed to learn table manners and proper evisceration etiquette. The Academy's crystalline spires jutted from the planet's crimson surface like fangs from a cosmic jaw, a architectural choice that the Board of Trustees felt was both aesthetically pleasing and appropriately intimidating. The building materials themselves were sourced from the fossilized remains of extinct megafauna, because nothing said refined education quite like studying atop the bones of something that once ruled an entire ecosystem. Professor Crakes, the Academy's head of practical termination studies, clicked his mandibles in what passed for satisfaction as he surveyed his domain. His species, the Velthara, had evolved from hive-hunting arthropods whose ancestors had perfected the art of dissolving their prey from the inside out. Now, millions of years later, here he stood in a pressed suit and tie, teaching youngsters how to kill with dignity and proper form. Evolution, it seemed, had a sense of irony that would make philosophers weep. The student body represented the cream of the galactic predator crop. There were the Thaxian younglings, whose shark-like ancestors had terrorized 3 different ocean worlds before developing spaceflight. Their descendants still retained those charming rows of serrated teeth, and the ability to smell fear from several star systems away. The morphic hunters from the Kepler belt sent their shape-shifting offspring, creatures that could assume any form necessary to get close to their prey before revealing their true, nightmarish nature. And who could forget the delightful Sicaris children, whose telepathic abilities allowed them to paralyze their victims with pure, distilled terror before feeding on their psychic emanations. Each species had earned their place through millennia of successful predation, having clawed their way to the top of their respective food chains with such efficiency that they'd eventually run out of things to hunt. Hence the Academy, because when you've mastered killing everything on your home planet, the logical next step is apparently learning how to do it with class. The curriculum was as refined as it was deadly. Morning lectures covered topics like sustainable hunting practices and the ethics of efficient termination. Afternoon practicals included such charming subjects as advanced stalking techniques and psychological warfare for the modern predator. The Academy even offered electives in cross-species intimidation and proper carcass presentation, because apparently there was a right way and a wrong way to display one's kills. For 3 centuries, the Academy had maintained its reputation as the galaxy's most exclusive institution of higher carnage. Its graduates went on to become fleet admirals, corporate executives, and heads of state, positions where their natural predatory instincts could be channeled into more socially acceptable forms of dominance. The waiting list for admission stretched longer than a Centaurian death worm, and the entrance exams had a mortality rate that would make medical school look like a playground, which made the morning's announcement all the more shocking. Professor Crakes' secondary arms trembled slightly as he reread the official communication from the Galactic Education Consortium. The holographic text floated before his compound eyes, each word more unbelievable than the last. A human, an actual, genuine, certified Deathworlder human, had not only applied to the Academy, but had somehow been accepted through the standard admissions process. The Velthara professor's ichor ran cold as he contemplated the implications. Humans were legendary throughout the galaxy, spoken of in whispered conversations and campfire horror stories. They came from a Class 12 Deathworld, a planet so hostile that simply surviving childhood was considered a feat worthy of galactic recognition. Their species had evolved not as specialized predators, but as something far more terrifying, generalist survivors who could adapt to virtually any threat. The other faculty members were equally disturbed by the news. During the emergency staff meeting, Professor Itak, whose species had evolved from ambush predators that could remain motionless for decades, actually fidgeted in his chair. The morphic studies instructor kept unconsciously shifting between defensive forms, while the Sicaris professor's mental shields were so tightly locked that he was giving everyone in the room a headache. But Academy policy was clear. Any species that could meet the admission requirements must be accommodated. The fact that no human had ever applied before was irrelevant. The Galactic Education Consortium's anti-discrimination policies were ironclad, and the Academy's prestigious accreditation depended on compliance. Besides, how dangerous could one human really be? The maintenance crew had worked through the night, installing emergency containment fields around Classroom Alpha 7. The walls now featured reinforced durasteel plating, psychic dampeners, and enough weaponry to stop a small military assault. Professor Krex had insisted on the modifications after reviewing the human homeworld's environmental reports, which read like a catalogue of creative ways the universe could try to kill you. Earth's surface was 70% liquid that could drown you, with weather patterns that included frozen precipitation, electromagnetic storms, and atmospheric disturbances that could level cities. The solid portions featured unstable geological formations that regularly shifted without warning, temperature variations that could flash freeze or incinerate exposed tissue, and an atmosphere that was technically breathable but contained enough reactive oxygen to support combustion. The planet's gravity was strong enough to crush most species, while its rotation generated magnetic fields that could scramble sensitive electronics. And that was just the inanimate environment. The biosphere was even worse. The Academy's Xenobiology department had compiled a preliminary report on Earth's ecosystem that read like a fever dream penned by a sadistic cosmic horror writer. Microscopic organisms that could devour flesh from the inside, plants that could poison, strangle, or digest unwary creatures, weather patterns that spawned rotating wind columns capable of flinging massive objects across continents. And somewhere in this hellscape, humans had not only survived, but thrived, to the point of achieving spaceflight. The student body's reaction to the news had been equally dramatic. The young Thaxians had spent the morning comparing bite force measurements and debating whether human bone would splinter or compress under pressure. The morphic juveniles kept shifting into what they imagined humans might look like, producing increasingly grotesque approximations based on second-hand descriptions and wild speculation. The Psychari's younglings had formed a telepathic link to share their collective nightmares about Deathworld encounters. Professor Krex surveyed his classroom, noting how his students had unconsciously arranged themselves in defensive positions. The Thaxians had claimed the back corners, where they could observe all approaches while keeping their backs protected. The Morphics had positioned themselves near the ventilation systems, ready to escape through the ducts if necessary. The Psychari's cluster had formed a tight circle in the center of the room, their mental defenses overlapping like shields in a phalanx formation. The morning's first lesson had been completely abandoned in favor of impromptu survival training. Instead of discussing proper stalking postures, the class had devolved into a strategy session on how to deal with Deathworld encounters. Theoretical, of course. None of them had ever actually met a human, but that hadn't stopped them from developing elaborate contingency plans based on fragmented intelligence reports and wild rumors. The door chimed softly, and every conversation stopped immediately. Professor Krex's mandibles clicked nervously as he activated the classroom's defensive systems, just in case. The emergency medical team was on standby in the hallway, and security had positioned themselves at strategic intervals throughout the building. Everyone held their breath as the portal slid open. What walked through the door was not the towering monster of sharp teeth and acidic saliva they had expected. Nor was it the shape-shifting horror of adaptive camouflage and predatory cunning that their nightmares had suggested. Instead, a perfectly ordinary-looking bipedal creature entered the classroom, carrying what appeared to be a simple fabric bag, slung over one shoulder. The human was smaller than most of the students, lacking any visible natural weapons. No fangs protruded from its mouth, no claws extended from its digits, no armored plates covered its vulnerable flesh. Its skin was a pale pink color that looked disturbingly fragile, and its eyes were positioned forward-facing, like a predator's, but lacked any of the usual intimidating features. No glowing irises, no vertical pupils, no obvious signs of enhanced visual processing. Most shocking of all, the creature looked around the room with what could only be described as polite confusion. "Excuse me," the human said, its voice carrying none of the expected menace or otherworldly harmonics. "Is this Professor Krex's Practical Termination Studies class? I think I might be lost." The silence stretched on for several heartbeats. Professor Krex found himself staring at the creature, trying to reconcile the horror stories with the mundane reality standing before him. This was a Deathworlder? This soft, defenseless-looking being had survived on a Class 12 hostile environment? You are... Professor Krex's translator struggled with the unfamiliar phonemes. The human student? That's right, the human replied, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. Sorry I'm a bit late. I had trouble finding the building. Your campus map doesn't really account for three-dimensional navigation, and I kept taking wrong turns at the gravity lifts. A Thaxian student's jaw had dropped open, revealing 3 rows of serrated teeth. One of the morphics had unconsciously shifted into what appeared to be a defensive spore cloud. The Sycaris cluster was broadcasting confused telepathic static that was giving everyone a headache. The human noticed the stares and offered what appeared to be a facial expression involving the upward curvature of its mouth. Hi everyone, I'm really excited to be here. I've heard so much about the Academy's reputation. Professor Krex's secondary arms began to twitch involuntarily. In all his years of teaching, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. His students were apex predators from the galaxy's most dangerous species, and they were all visibly intimidated by what appeared to be the most harmless creature any of them had ever seen, which, if the reports about Deathworlders were accurate, probably meant they were in more danger than they realized. After a morning of awkward introductions and even more awkward small talk, Professor Krex decided to proceed with the day's planned practical exercise. The virtual hunting grounds were the Academy's pride and joy, a holographic simulation system that could recreate any environment and populate it with any prey species imaginable. It was here that students learned to apply their natural abilities in controlled scenarios before moving on to actual field exercises. The simulation chamber was a vast, featureless room lined with holometers and sensor arrays. When activated, it could become anything from a deep ocean trench to the canopy of a jungle world. Today's scenario was set on a temperate forest moon, complete with a variety of small to medium-sized prey animals that would test the students' hunting instincts without overwhelming their developing skills. Professor Krex explained the exercise with his usual professional detachment, though he kept stealing glances at the human student who was taking notes with primitive marking implements on what appeared to be processed tree pulp. The other students had state-of-the-art neural interfaces and memory enhancement implants, but the Deathworlder was using actual physical writing tools like some kind of primitive savage. Each student will enter the simulation individually, Professor Krex announced, his mandibles clicking with nervous energy. You will have 30 standard minutes to locate, stalk, and terminate as many prey animals as possible. The simulation will monitor your technique, efficiency, and adherence to proper predatory protocols. Questions? A young Thaxian raised a clawed appendage. What happens if the human goes into some kind of Deathworld frenzy and attacks the equipment? The simulation chamber is equipped with emergency containment systems, Professor Krex replied, though privately he wondered if they would be sufficient. Standard safety protocols are in effect. The morphic student, who had been practicing intimidating shapes all morning, asked, "Should we evacuate the observation deck when it's the human's turn?" Professor Krex's compound eyes twitched. That will not be necessary. The observation area is completely sealed and monitored. One of the Sycaris' younglings projected a nervous thought pulse that roughly translated to, "What if it learns our weaknesses by watching our techniques?" "All students observe all other students," Professor Krex replied firmly. "That is standard academic protocol." The human raised its hand, an apparently primitive gesture for requesting attention. "Will there be any specific equipment provided, or should we rely on our natural abilities?" "Natural abilities only," Professor Krex confirmed. "The purpose is to evaluate your species' evolved hunting instincts." The human nodded and made another notation on its primitive writing material. Professor Krex found this behavior deeply unsettling. What kind of creature took notes about hunting exercises? The other students hunted by instinct, by genetic programming honed over millions of years of evolution. They didn't need to study their prey or analyze hunting patterns. They simply acted according to their nature. But this Deathworlder was treating predation like an academic subject, something to be learned and optimized through systematic observation. The implications were disturbing. If humans approached hunting as a science rather than an art, What did that suggest about their capacity for adaptation and improvement? Most species reached their evolutionary peak and plateaued. Humans apparently were still taking notes. The first student to enter the simulation was a young Thaxian, whose razor-sharp teeth and powerful jaw muscles made him a formidable predator by any reasonable standard. The holographic forest materialized around him, complete with the sounds of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Within minutes, he had located a group of rabbit-like herbivores and dispatched 3 of them, with textbook stalking and ambush. The second student was a morphic who demonstrated the versatility of adaptive camouflage by assuming the form of a harmless plant before striking at unsuspecting prey that wandered too close. Her technique was flawless, her efficiency impressive, and her kill count respectable. The Psychara student used telepathic manipulation to confuse and disorient his prey, before closing in for quick, clean kills. His approach was more subtle than the others, but equally effective within the context of his species' natural abilities. Each performance was met with appreciative clicks, chirps, and telepathic applause from the other students. These were apex predators doing what they were designed to do, and the results were exactly what Professor Krex had expected from his advanced placement class. Then it was the humans' turn. The Deathworlder approached the simulation chamber entrance with the same casual demeanor it had displayed all day. No apparent nervousness, no visible preparation for intimacy, no signs of the predatory focus that preceded a hunt. It simply walked into the chamber as if it were entering a library or cafeteria. The forest simulation activated around the human, who stood motionless for several long moments, apparently doing nothing. The observation deck fell silent as students and faculty waited for some sign of the legendary Deathworlder hunting instincts to manifest. Instead, the human began walking, not stalking, not prowling, not employing any of the stealth techniques that had been demonstrated by the other students. Just walking. At a steady, unhurried pace through the holographic forest, making no apparent effort to conceal its presence or mask its scent trail. Professor Kreck's mandibles clicked in confusion. What is it doing? The human continued its leisurely stroll through the simulated woodland, occasionally pausing to examine trees or rock formations. It showed no interest in the various prey animals that could be seen moving through the underbrush. When a group of deer-like creatures bounded across its path, the human simply watched them go without making any attempt to give chase. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The other students began to whisper among themselves, speculating about whether the human was defective or perhaps operating according to some incomprehensible Deathworld strategy. At the 20-minute mark, something changed. The human's casual pace began to have an effect on the simulation's prey animals. They had initially scattered when the bipedal predator entered their territory, but as the minutes passed and no immediate attack came, they began to relax their guard. Some had even returned to their feeding grounds, assuming the strange creature posed no immediate threat. That was when the human's true nature began to reveal itself. What happened next would be discussed in academic circles for decades to come, analyzed in doctoral dissertations and cited in comparative xenobiology textbooks across the galaxy. The human didn't just hunt, it systematically dismantled the entire ecosystem's understanding of what predation meant. The bipedal Deathworlder had spent 20 minutes mapping the simulation's terrain, identifying water sources, noting animal behavior patterns, and cataloging the various species' habits with the methodical precision of a scientist. Now, with only 10 minutes remaining, it began to implement a strategy so alien to conventional predatory thinking that Professor Krex's translator struggled to find appropriate terms. Instead of selecting a single target and stalking it in the traditional manner, the human began what could only be described as psychological warfare on an ecosystem-wide scale. It positioned itself near the primary water source and began making subtle movements and sounds designed not to catch prey, but to create a persistent, low-level sense of unease among all the animals in the area. The human didn't chase the herbivores, it followed them, not with the explosive speed of a typical predator, but with an inexorable, steady persistence that gradually eroded their ability to rest or feed. Every time a group of animals settled down to graze, the human would appear at the edge of their vision, not close enough to trigger immediate flight responses, but present enough to maintain constant stress levels. "It's not hunting them," whispered one of the Psycharis students, his telepathic abilities picking up the growing panic among the simulated prey animals. It's terrorizing them. The deer-like creatures that had bounded so confidently across the human's path earlier were now exhausted from repeated false alarms. The rabbit analogues had worn themselves out with unnecessary sprints to safety. The bird equivalents had depleted their energy reserves with constant vigilance flights. But the human strategy was more sophisticated than simple exhaustion tactics. It had been observing the animal's social structures and was now exploiting them with surgical precision. When it noticed that the herbivores relied on sentinel behavior, individuals standing watch while others fed, the human began approaching from multiple angles, forcing the entire group to maintain constant vigilance. When the prey animals attempted to flee to higher ground, they discovered that the human had somehow anticipated their route and was waiting for them. Not to attack, but to simply be present, forcing them to change direction and expend more energy seeking alternative escape routes. Professor Krex watched in growing horror as his simulation's carefully balanced ecosystem began to collapse under the weight of sustained psychological pressure. The prey animals were making increasingly desperate decisions, abandoning safe feeding areas, ignoring their young, and splitting up into smaller, more vulnerable groups. "This is impossible," muttered the Thaxian student. "Where's the kill strike? Where's the feeding behavior?" As if in response to the question, the human finally moved into what could be recognized as an active hunting phase. But instead of the explosive violence that characterized typical predatory behavior, the Deathworlder simply began jogging. Not sprinting, not charging, jogging, at a pace that would have been embarrassingly slow by the standards of any self-respecting predator. The exhausted prey animals, already stressed beyond their normal coping mechanisms, found themselves being pursued by a creature that seemed capable of maintaining its steady pace indefinitely. One by one, the simulated animals began to collapse from exhaustion, not torn apart by claws or fangs, not paralyzed by venom or psychic attack, but simply run to death by an organism that refused to stop moving. The human would approach each fallen animal, deliver a quick, efficient termination using improvised tools crafted from simulation debris, and then continue its relentless pursuit of the remaining prey. By the time the 30-minute limit expired, the human had achieved a kill count that exceeded all the other students combined. But more disturbing than the numbers was the method, a form of predation so alien to galactic norms that none of the observers had initially recognized it as hunting at all. The simulation chamber powered down, returning to its featureless state. The human emerged looking slightly winded but otherwise unchanged, offering that same inexplicable facial expression to the stunned observers. "That was fun," the Deathworlder commented, apparently oblivious to the existential crisis it had just triggered among the galaxy's supposedly apex predators. "Though I have to say, your prey species aren't really adapted for persistence hunting. On my homeworld, most of the large herbivores have much better endurance." Professor Krex's mandibles clicked involuntarily as he processed the implications of that casual observation. This level of performance was what humans considered recreational? What exactly were they dealing with on their homeworld that required even greater capabilities? The other students stared at the human with a mixture of awe and terror. They had spent their lives perfecting killing techniques based on their species' natural advantages: speed, strength, venom, psychic abilities. The human possessed none of these specialized traits, yet had achieved results that rendered their evolutionary advantages seemingly insignificant. "How?" asked the Psycharis student, his mental voice barely above a whisper. "You have no natural weapons, no enhanced senses, no apparent physical advantages. How did you do that?" The human shrugged, another primitive gesture that somehow conveyed complex meaning. "Pattern recognition, mostly, and endurance. My species evolved as persistence hunters on a world where everything else was bigger, stronger, and faster than us. We learned to use our brains instead of our bodies." Professor Krex filed his report that evening with trembling secondary appendages. The galaxy's most prestigious predator academy had just been schooled in the art of hunting by a creature that looked like it couldn't successfully stalk a potted plant. The implications were staggering, and the academic world would never be quite the same. As he reviewed the day's events, Professor Krex found himself reaching an uncomfortable conclusion. The galaxy's apex predators had spent millennia perfecting the art of being dangerous, Humans, apparently, had spent the same time perfecting the art of being inescapable. Perhaps the most unsettling realization was that the human student had displayed no malice, no bloodlust, no apparent enjoyment of the killing itself. It had approached the exercise with the same casual competence it might bring to solving a mathematical equation or assembling furniture. For this species, wholesale ecosystem disruption was apparently just another Tuesday. The professor's final log entry contained a recommendation that would echo through the halls of galactic academia for generations. Perhaps we have been teaching the wrong subject all along. It may be time to establish a department of not being hunted by humans. Word of the incident spread through the galactic academic network with the speed of gossip and the weight of scientific revolution. Within hours, xenobiology departments across 17 systems were requesting copies of the simulation recordings. Military academies began revising their tactical doctrines, and several governments quietly initiated defensive studies focusing on persistent threat mitigation. The human student, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the paradigm shift their casual demonstration had triggered. They attended the next day's classes with the same polite enthusiasm, took notes on their primitive writing materials, and asked thoughtful questions about proper prey-stalking etiquette. When Professor Krex nervously inquired about human hunting traditions, the Deathworlder cheerfully explained concepts like marathon running and ultra-marathons, recreational activities where humans voluntarily subjected themselves to the same persistence hunting techniques for entertainment purposes. The revelation that humans engaged in persistence hunting as a form of leisure activity sent fresh waves of existential dread through the faculty. Professor Yithak, whose species could remain motionless for decades, developed what could only be described as nervous fidgeting. The morphic instructor began unconsciously shifting into increasingly defensive forms during lectures, while the Psycharis professor's mental shields had become so rigid that he was essentially broadcasting telepathic white noise. Student enrollment patterns shifted dramatically in the following semester. The waiting list for advanced evasion techniques suddenly stretched longer than the Academy's traditional predation courses. A new elective titled Understanding Persistent Pursuit Psychology was added to the curriculum, though finding qualified instructors proved challenging since no faculty member wanted to study the subject too closely. The most telling change came in the Academy's marketing materials. The phrase apex predator quietly disappeared from official documentation, replaced with the more diplomatically neutral, specialized hunting excellence. The admissions board added a new category to their evaluation criteria: species compatibility assessment, which was academic speak for how likely is this applicant to psychologically devastate our existing student body. Professor Kreck's mandibles clicked with bitter amusement as he reviewed these institutional changes. The galaxy's most prestigious predator academy had been fundamentally altered by a single human who had treated their most challenging exercise as casual entertainment. The cosmic irony was that the human student remained genuinely enthusiastic about learning from their classmates, completely oblivious to the fact that the real education was flowing in the opposite direction. After all, when faced with a species that had turned persistence into an art form and psychological warfare into casual recreation, the galaxy's former apex predators might need to learn an entirely new set of survival skills. The universe, it seemed, still had a few lessons to teach about what it truly meant to be dangerous.